I'm Alexandre Marc, and I'm the cluster leader for the Conflict, Crime and Violence team in the Social Development Department.
I'm Alys Willman, Social Development Specialist and co-coordinator of the Violence in the City study.
The Social Development Department has just published a study called Violence in the City, and that looks at the community responses to violent situation and what can be done about it. This is the results of a work that took place over the last 2 years. So the study was involved field work in 5 countries: South Africa, Kenya, Haiti, Timor-Leste and Brazil. It looked at poor urban center and how the population was coping around the issue of violence and how the policies were implemented in those areas and how successful they were. In the world today, about 60 countries have level of violence that really does not allow them to fulfill all their economic and social potential. This is about 1/3 of the bank clients. This is a very high level, and it has a very strong impact not only on the economy but also on human development. Of course, the violence recently has changed a lot. Traditionally, violence as part of conflict was the largest part, represented the largest part of the homicides in the world. Since the end of the Cold War, things are changing and conflict are diminishing, but the overall level of violence does not seem to be diminishing. Urban violence and street violence, interpersonal violence, has become the major cause of homicides in the world. And because today more people will live in urban centers, actually about half of the world population lives in urban center, the issue of urban violence requires more and more urgent responses. Latin America especially and Africa know a very high level of urban violence, and of course it varies a lot according to the cities and according to the countries. But the good news is that we know that some development policies work and that for violence prevention. We also know that violence prevention is not only a matter of security and justice reform, but also a matter of policies for inclusion and cohesion. And these policies are real development policies. And so we believe that this is a very important area and that the World Bank cannot turn its back to answering some of those issues, mostly for 3 reasons. First is that more and more clients are coming to the World Bank to ask them for support for dealing with those issues of high level of crime and violence. Secondly, because as mentioned earlier, development policies seems to work in some cases, and you have the case of Colombia, for example, that has reduced recently quite drastically its level of urban violence. Because the donor community increasingly is getting mobilized behind this agenda, and finally because clients are requesting the bank to come and work in this area. This report focuses more specifically about the issue of community development because we believe that that's a central issue, especially for social development. And this is an issue that maybe has been a little bit neglected in terms of the most recent study. And therefore we focused and looked at the way community can get organized to be able to face the issue of high level of violence.
What we really wanted to understand with this study is, in these high violence urban communities, how does violence impact the everyday lives of the people who live there? What impacts do they see on a daily basis, and how does it impact how they relate to each other? And then in particular, what sources of resilience are there that we might be able to learn from and perhaps support in the work that we do in urban communities that are addressing the problem of violence. So what we found was it doesn't have to necessarily be surprising, but it's definitely very insightful. First of all, that people in the urban environments do not differentiate between the different types of violence as much as policymakers do. What I mean by that is usually you have policymakers that look at or study wars, and they'll look at how many people get killed on a battlefield, and then you have a whole separate group of people that's looking at violence that happens in the house, and another group of people that's looking at violence that happens between gangs. And it gives the impression that these forms of violence are completely unrelated. But in the lives of the residents that we interviewed, these forms of violence intersect, and they are inextricably linked. Particularly strong was the link between violence that happens in the home and violence that happens later on in the street, as when a child witnesses abuse in the home and then later joins a gang or a rebel group. So this tells us that we need to be looking more in coordination in an integrated way at these types of violence, and perhaps addressing them in a more integrated fashion than we currently are. The second thing that we found was that the coping mechanisms that people employ on a daily basis were almost exclusively individual level coping mechanisms, and most of them actually undermine long-term violence prevention. The coping mechanisms, when I say they're at an individual level, what I mean is that people would the most popular response was to do nothing about the violence that they were threatened with or were experiencing. After that, it was to change their route to school or to work, or to drop out of school, or to change jobs. So violence had a very serious impact on mobility. And then there were more, I would say, extreme measures that people would take that had to do with protecting themselves, like buying a gun or joining a vigilante group or a militia group, which in the long term really undermines the kind of sustainable violence prevention that I think we would want to see. The third finding was that the built environment has a really strong relationship with violence, and this is something that people perceived across the board, that they're not able to come together, even if they had the social cohesion and social capital to come together, they don't have a place to have a meeting. They don't have a safe spot in their neighborhood, or they can't get to that safe spot because the streets are so insecure. That was another important thing. And then the final point was that most people perceived unemployment to be the sole cause, or at least the principal cause, of violence. Now, there's been tons of research on this that shows that you can't necessarily link unemployment to violence, and it's kind of a fuzzy connection, but the fact that people in their own experiences make that connection means it's important for us to address in policy. The recommendations from this report are meant to be more general orientations for the way we intervene in environments that are suffering from high violence. I think the most important thing to remember is that violence is not inevitable in urban areas. There are plenty of cities that are quite large and growing rapidly that do not suffer the same problems of violence as the Rio de Janeiros or the Juarez, Mexicos. So it is something that we can prevent. And the first step is probably to send strong signals to the population that the situation is going to change. Because without that feeling that things are going to be different, you really can't have the kind of collective action or even building of trust, basic trust, that you need to be able to enforce the social controls around violence. People won't scold each other's children even when they see them behaving violently, or they won't intervene when they see a crime being committed unless they feel that the environment is secure enough for them to be able to do that without being retaliated against or threatened themselves. So we have to send those important signals. The other thing is to address the relationships between the violence that we see, particularly the relationship between violence that happens in the private sphere and violence in the public sphere. So we need to be thinking not just about gang violence in itself when we do a program, but thinking about how the violence is learned in the home and later translates to the private sphere. One of the more concrete recommendations, I would say, is that we need to be working on improving the built environment in many of these communities. Better street lighting, better roads where police can actually get in to patrol, community spaces where people can meet safely and go home safely afterwards. And then finally, there's a need for stronger coordination across the agencies in different countries that are responsible for violence prevention. There's usually no one government entity that takes full responsibility for preventing violence. The police probably take most of it, but the public health sector is also involved. The infrastructure sector is also involved. Many ministries, many agencies on the municipal level are involved. So often coordinating that is the biggest task that a lot of countries face, and I think that's an area where the World Bank could play a key role. For example, we have some work that's just starting now, a development policy loan to Brazil, and part of that loan will support social programs in some of the favelas that have recently been pacified with these military operations from the police. That's one example where we are putting our money behind helping the government coordinate across all the different existing programs to make them more effective.
So we are already using the results of this study in a number of instances, and Alys just mentioned the case of Brazil. This is the first development development policy loan that a bank is providing with a component on violence reduction. This is a loan provided to the state of Rio de Janeiro, and it supports a program that comes after pacification of the favelas by the police, and that deploy a vast array of social services. And there we're using some of the findings of the studies to advise our colleague and the government around community participation, around coordination issues, around some of the communication issues on this program. In another instances now, we're starting some work with the government of Mexico. And there are major issues of coordinations, and also because so much attention have focused on the gang war, people have tended to leave aside the problem of day-to-day marginalization that are actually very central for how the gangs recruits among some of the youth and some of the people in poor neighborhood in Mexico. So there's certainly a need to refocus and reshift the attention to those preventive development policies. And there also we plan to use the results of this work in our policy advice. The third example is the one of Jamaica. And in Jamaica, one of the main issues there is with the level of violence is the connection between politics and the gang violence, and also the marginalization of certain neighborhoods. So this is another area where we're actually going to look at the findings of this study in the way we're going to provide advice to the government. In Africa, there's two cities where we've started work with some pilot. One is Nairobi, when there's a pilot community development program that aims at organizing, helping the community to get organized against violence. And here we're starting a policy dialogue with the municipality and the urban authority about how to link it with the broader strategy for urban development. Finally, in Ivory Coast, we're also starting a similar work in the city of Abidjan, where we're going to look at the way the government and the city authorities can focus on some of the poorer neighborhood to try and bring the community together around some basic activities that can help reduce violence.